Now in the previous video we talked about the parotid gland which is present in the parotid region. Now we are going to talk about its external features. It mainly resembles a three-sided pyramid. I have this three-sided pyramid to teach you this whole method. Now in this three-sided pyramid, is as you can see, it has three borders, mainly this border, and this border over here. Now it has a apex, also it has a base. The apex is directed downwards and this base is directed upwards. Now this base, we call this the superior surface. Mainly we have four surfaces, that is superior surface or the base, the superficial surface, the anteromedial surface and the posteromedial surfaces. And we have three borders, the anterior, posterior and the medial border. First of all, we will place it somewhere over here like this. This is our anterior border. This over here is our medial border. This posteriorly, this is our posterior border. So anterior border, medial border and posterior border. Mainly you know that the surface between the anterior border and the medial border, it will be known as the anteromedial surface. Similarly, the surface that is present between the medial and the posterior border will be known as the posteromedial surface. Similarly, the surface that is present between the anterior and the posterior border, that is the superficial surface. And the surface that is present above, that is the superior surface. Now the parotid gland is directed something like this. This superficial surface is going to face our cheek region. This superior surface will be upwards. This anterior border will be projecting over to the anterior side, posterior border to the posterior side, apex will be directed downwards. And you can see here is the anteromedial surface, over here will be the posteromedial surface. And this superficial surface will be in contact towards the cheek region. Now we will talk about relations of the border. First of all, we have the anterior border. The anterior border is mainly related to terminal branches of the facial nerve, then the facial vessels, then there is accessory parotid gland and its process, and the parotid duct. Over here in this diagram that is also given in your BD, we can see all the parts that are related to it. So first of all, this is the, we are to visualize, this is the anterior border, and on this anterior border we have 5 main branches of the facial nerve. These all yellow branches, these are the branches of facial nerve. How to remember the facial nerve branches? You just place your hand like this and you have temporal branch, then you have the zygomatic branch, then you have the buccal branch. The buccal branch is divided into an upper buccal and a lower buccal branch, and then we have the lower branch which is also known as the cervical branch. So these are the 5 branches of the facial nerve that are coming or emerging from the anterior border. Then I told you there is one another thing, that is the transverse facial vessels. So we have the facial vessels, that is transverse facial artery mainly. Then we have the accessory parotid gland. So we have this accessory parotid gland also, that is the facial process of the gland that is radiating forwards. Apart from this, we also have the parotid duct. So 4 things, all of them have been covered. First thing, parotid duct. Here is the parotid duct. The terminal branches of facial nerve, all the 5 branches, the yellow ones, they have been covered. Then transverse facial vessels, the vessel, the one in red, they have been covered. Then accessory parotid gland, this accessory portion of the parotid gland has also been covered. Now we will talk about the posterior border. The posterior border cannot be visualized over here, but we can clearly see over here that the posterior border is related to the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So here we have the posterior border being related to the sternocleidomastoid muscle. You have the posterior border related to sternocleidomastoid muscle. Then medial edge or the pharyngeal border, that this is, if this is our cube, so the medial, this one that I have written over here is the medial border. It is mainly related to the wall of the pharynx and the lateral wall of the pharynx. With that, we come to an end to the relations of border. Now we will talk about the relation of all the surfaces. And I told you how many surfaces there are. Between the anterior border and the medial border, the anteromedial surface. Between the medial border and the posterior border, the posteromedial surface. Between the anterior and the posterior border, the superficial surface. And superiorly, we have the superior surface. We will talk about the relations of all these surfaces now. First of all, we are going to talk about this surface, the superficial surface that is between the anterior and the posterior border, and it is directed towards our cheek. And as you know, it is directed towards our cheek, so we will continue from the outside to inside. First of all, we will see the skin, then we can see the superficial fascia, then the parotid or the deep fascia, then we have deep parotid lymph nodes that are going to be present in this gland majorly. So gland has deep parotid lymph nodes, and exterior to it we had the skin, the superficial and the deep fascia, which is also known as the parotid fascia. Now the superficial fascia, which is mainly pierced by the great auricular nerve, it has preauricular or subparotid lymph nodes. Also it has posterior fibers of platysma and rosarius, which are two muscles. And the parotid fascia, the deep fascia, it is thick, it is adherent. So here in this diagram you can see the superficial surface. The superficial surface mainly has the skin, then it has the superficial fascia, then it has the platysma muscle, and somewhere here the rhizorius muscle can also be present. Both of the muscles are present in the superficial fascia. Then we have the deep fascia, that is the parotid fascia, which is shown by this green color border. Also this parotid fascia has certain parotid lymph nodes, and then we have the surface of the parotid gland, which has certain other lymph nodes. So skin, superficial fascia, the deep fascia, and then the parotid gland with its parotid lymph nodes. That is all the relations of the superficial surface that are between the anterior and the posterior borders. Now situated just above the base, forming the base or the superior surface of the gland, we have the superior surface. Now this superior surface is mainly small and concave, and it is related to external auditory meatus, mainly the cartilaginous part of this external acoustic meatus or external auditory meatus. This external acoustic meatus is this region, like you have an ear, and just from the ear we have the external acoustic meatus beginning from here. Firstly, it has some part which is known as the cartilaginous part. So mainly the superior surface is related to this cartilaginous part of the external acoustic meatus superiorly. Then it is also related to posterior surface of the temporomandibular joint. You can see the ramus of the mandible, and you can see this parotid gland is situated just on the posterior border of this ramus of mandible, and with this ramus of the mandible we have the temporomandibular joint over here. So we can say that the parotid gland is majorly related to, firstly, the cartilaginous part of this external acoustic meatus, secondly to the posterior border or posterior portion of this temporomandibular joint. After the two bony projections, we can talk about certain vessels. First vessel is superficial temporal vessel, which are superficial temporal blood vessels and superficial temporal veins. And then we have a nerve, that is the auricular temporal nerve. Let us look over here. So this is the superior surface, and mainly, as I told you, it was related to the external acoustic meatus. Apart from that external acoustic meatus and the temporomandibular joint, we have the superficial temporal vessels, which are superficial temporal artery and superficial temporal vein. After that, I told you there is a nerve, that is the auricular temporal nerve. So all the four relations of the superior surface, how it is related to two bony parts, and how the superficial temporal vessels and auricular temporal nerve are coming out of it, all of that have been covered. Now we are going to talk about this apex. As I told you, the apex is directed downwards over here. So this apex, which is directed downwards, it is firstly related to one muscle, that is the digastric muscle, and majorly its posterior belly, then adjoining part of the carotid triangle. So So here in this diagram you can see the parotid gland, and you can also visualize its apex, and you can see that towards its apex we have the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. So the apex majorly overlies the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. Also somewhere over here we have the carotid triangle. So apex is related to posterior belly of the digastric muscle. Apart from that, it is related to the carotid triangle. After that, it is related to cervical branch of the facial nerve. Now here you can see all the branches of the facial nerve, and over here in the apex region you can majorly see the cervical branch of the facial nerve coming out. So we talked about one muscle, that was digastric muscle. Then we talked about the carotid triangle. After that we talk about the cervical branch of the facial nerve that is exiting from the apex. Last relation is two divisions of the retromandibular vein. Now in this diagram you can see here is the apex, and in the apex you can see the anterior and the posterior divisions of the retromandibular vein which are coming from the apex. Also we have the cervical branch of the facial nerve that is coming out from the apex. So this is how we discuss the posterior belly of digastric muscle, the carotid triangle, the cervical branch of facial nerve, and two anterior and posterior division of the retromandibular vein. With that, we are done with the relations of apex. Now we will talk about the relations of anteromedial surface. Now we will talk about the anteromedial surface. As I told you, this anteromedial surface is between the anterior border and the medial border, and it will be directed something like this. So here is the anterior border, here is the medial border. So the part of this anteromedial surface is directed like this, and superiorly it is related to the superior surface, and inferiorly it is related to the apex. Now they are telling you that this anteromedial surface, first of all, it will be related to the lateral part of the temporomandibular joint. I told you this superior surface was related to the posterior part of the temporomandibular joint, but this anteromedial surface, it will be related to the lateral part of the temporomandibular joint. We have to remember this with the posterior part, this with the lateral part of the temporomandibular joint. So first relation is lateral surface of the temporomandibular joint. Second is going to be, we will discuss three portions side by side. One is the masseter muscle, one is the posterior border of ramus of mandible, and one is the medial pterygoid muscle. So when we come to this diagram, we can see the anteromedial surface directed like this, and when we come to this diagram, we can see the anteromedial surface directed like this. So it has three major relations. One is the masseter muscle, then is the posterior part of ramus of mandible, and then is the medial pterygoid muscle. All the two muscles and one ramus of the mandible is over here. Also I told you anteromedial surface will majorly be related to lateral surface of the temporomandibular joint. After that we have emerging branches of the facial nerve. So you can also see the branches of facial nerve coming from here. So all the relations have been covered: the masseter muscle, the posterior border of ramus of mandible, the medial pterygoid, the three of them covered. Emerging branches of facial nerve, the emerging branches of facial nerve over here, and also I told you it will be related to lateral surface of temporomandibular joint. After that we will talk about the posteromedial surface. As I told you when we were discussing this thing, that the posteromedial surface will now be between the medial border and the posterior surface. So this portion, it is the posteromedial surface, it will be directed something like this. The medial border will be over here, so the posteromedial surface will be over here like this. Now it is modulated to mastoid and styloid processes of the bones and structures that are attached to them. With the mastoid process, we have sternocleidomastoid and posterior belly of digastric muscle. So according to the diagram, if this is the posteromedial surface, so relations of the posteromedial surface show us the sternocleidomastoid and the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. The sternocleidomastoid and the posterior belly of the digastric muscle, both of which are attached to the mastoid process. After that, we have the styloid process with its attached muscles. So two things are related to posterior medial surface: mastoid process with its sternocleidomastoid and posterior belly of digastric muscle, the styloid process with its attached muscles. Apart from that, we have the external carotid artery and facial nerve. The posterior medial surface has facial nerve entering it. Also, deeply we have the internal carotid artery deep to the styloid process. So if you can see over here, majorly we have the mastoid process and the styloid process. Mastoid process has sternocleidomastoid muscle and the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. Now we have the facial nerve that is entering from the posterior medial surface, and majorly it is exiting from the anteromedial surface. So we did the mastoid process, the facial nerve entering. Then we have the styloid process with all the muscles that are attached to it. It is also related to the posterior medial surface. Now we have the external carotid artery. The external carotid artery is somewhere within the parotid gland, and the internal carotid artery, this is deep to the styloid process. So deep to the styloid process, we find internal carotid artery. Here we have the external carotid artery towards the gland. Here we have the styloid process with its muscles. Here we have the mastoid process with its two muscles, the sternocleidomastoid and the posterior belly of the digastric. And here we have the facial nerve that is entering it. So with that, we are done with all the relations of the posterior medial surface of the parotid gland. With that, we are ended with the all the surfaces, all the borders. A quick review is that we have majorly we have three borders: the anterior border, the medial border, and the posterior border. The surface between the anterior and the medial is anteromedial. The surface between the medial and the posterior is posteromedial. The thing that is directed downward is the apex. Opposite to the apex, the thing that is directed upwards is the base, that is the superior surface. Now between the anterior and the posterior border, we have the superficial surface. All the surfaces, all the borders, everything, the apex have been covered, the relations have been covered. You can watch the video again and again if you do not understand anything. If you understand anything from this video, please like, share and subscribe, and I will meet you guys in the next video explaining all the leftover topics of this chapter, and then we will be done with the parotid region, inshallah, very soon.